For my part, I sit in a hospital and I manage information and data. So the foundation of everything is information within the system. And so the problem that we have in many institutions is that data is siloed, it's not annotated properly. That essentially means that you will find the number 120. That is a piece of data, it's not a piece of information. It has no value until you attach a description to it. So systolic blood pressure of 120 means something, or starts to mean something. When was it taken? Well, you can have a time and date, but more importantly, you rely on where in the time course of a disease was it taken. So this process of annotating the data, as we call it semantically, is very challenging. A lot of institutions are nowhere near the place that they would need to be in order to support a lot of these VPH applications in terms of the tools and the modelling processes that would sit on top of these data structures. So for my part, that would be the single biggest challenge to start with, because everything stems from that. There are other challenges, such as where do we get the computer resources to run these models? They're quite intensive in terms of what they require. And whilst cloud computing is a buzzword, and in the consumer domain significantly, it's not quite as prevalent in healthcare, and that's because there are issues around security and confidentiality of data. Once we let things out onto the internet, people are rightly concerned about these things. So there are a whole raft of challenges around the governance and security, and making the patients of the healthcare system comfortable with concepts like that before we can move forward with them. That question is very domain specific, of course. The data required to make a cardiac model or simulation work well is entirely different to that you would need for osteoporosis hip type replacement simulation. So it is very domain specific. We do know that general clinical outcomes, and certainly things like comorbidities, what other things does the patient have wrong with them, are generally relevant to almost all of these types of applications, because they all carry risk factors with them. More importantly than the data that's needed for the simulation is what will come back from the simulation, because in the health environment we understand our data to a large degree. We may not deal with it particularly well, but we know what it is. Once these simulations start feeding back indices of this and that, complex physics type properties or risks, those would be very challenging for our clinicians to interpret, I think. And so that there is a massive amount of work to be done on the clinical interpretation of the outputs of a lot of the processes that the VPH is pushing forward in terms of simulations and tools. I would envisage these technologies in their specific domains will come into the clinic through probably technical services offered to the clinicians themselves. For instance, radiologists are clinicians, of course, but when someone has an X-ray taken or a CT scan done, the radiologist will look at the images. They're trained, they understand the nuances of the imaging. They produce a report, which is then given to actually the treating physician. I would imagine a very similar model will have to be applied to these types of processes, or a complex simulation will be done by maybe clinical scientists who understand the physics of the processes, understand the nuances of what the results may or may not mean in the context of the clinical setting, and then they will probably produce reports and send them back to the referring clinicians to take action on. I would think that is how we will see these services delivered in a hospital. The clinicians themselves didn't really want to interpret the results and do the analyses actually, but when they got the feedback and the graphical display of an aneurysm with the blood flowing around it and swirling to it, what they actually found is that whilst they didn't draw any real clinical value from those, when they were discussing it with the patients, it was a clear, obvious concept of what was happening to the patient. And in terms of the whole consent process and taking the patient through the journey of what was going to happen to them, they found these new technologies really quite valuable in that context. So I can see that certainly, whether it's a tablet or a computer screen or whatever, the visualization type things, and if it's some kind of model of growth of a tumour or reduction of the tumour after a treatment plan, taking the patient on that journey with the clinicians and helping them really be informed can be a place where these technologies can really help. It's always exciting. I mean, you can never really pick any point in time in this domain that's not, 20 years ago, was it dull? No, it wasn't. We had things like PACS on the way where everybody could view images all over the hospital from anywhere in seconds. It was an amazing transformation. It's always an interesting place to work. Will it be fantastic when we have whole body simulations where we can tell what you're going to fall down with in 20 years time? Yes, of course, there'll be many steps on the way, and a lot of them will significantly impact on patients' lives and the care they get. So that's kind of what drives me in the healthcare context to do, and there's always something interesting on the horizon. There's never one point that's more exciting than the other, I don't think. This is a significant topic for research still. With cloud technologies and everything being internet-based, we have issues with security, we have issues with encryption, and just general issues with trust. We see in the headlines all the time that Sony and other big institutions get hacked for credit card records. Now, that's not good, but it's relatively benign compared to if that was your health record that had been hacked into. So I'm sure there will be a lot of unease in the public sector. Certainly there's a massive amount of unease in the healthcare sector about whether we use these services at the moment. At this present time, it's almost an embargoed no answer. If we wish to use these types of services, we would host them ourselves inside our hospital or inside an NHS data centre, which is starting to become available. Using Amazon for such things is financially very economical and desirable, but we're not there yet in terms of the processes and the trust relationships we have with these people. And I think we have a lot more work to do at both the technical level in terms of infrastructure and security, and how do you know who someone is? Username and password, we all know those are quite vulnerable. Just identity management when you're talking about patients accessing their healthcare records as well is a challenge. I haven't seen any particularly outstanding solutions to these problems yet. There are many ways that people are going about it, but nothing presents itself obviously as the way forward in this context. And I think we do need to do some serious work as a community on maybe it's a PR issue, but there are technical challenges as well, and we need to resolve them. Another example, things are already happening to some degree in the world now. Radiology is another example. You can send your radiology scans to a site in Europe, they'll report them, send the reports back to you instead of having your own local radiologists do it. So services like these do exist. They tend to be single point services like radiology reporting service, not the more general utilise some massive computer resource to come up with a treatment plan for your patient. And those very targeted solutions can have their own security, and we can go through a very focused security audit process with them. The more general case is harder to handle because people like Amazon try to be as flexible as they can be, and unfortunately flexibility is almost the antithesis of security. The most secure thing to do is nothing, of course. So there's a lot of work to be done to get to where the VPH and the digital patient would want to be with utilising vast computational resources on the cloud. I think it is as much a PR issue as a technical issue. I mean, there are technical issues to be resolved for sure, but people just get incredibly nervous because they don't understand, and that's what makes people nervous. Usually when you can educate people, they tend to come around a bit. I mean, the real challenge is that actually people use things like online banking, and that is held up as the most risky thing you can do on the internet. In fact, it's not. Actually, the only bad thing that happens is someone steals your money and the bank gives you it back. It's very easy to recompense someone for online fraud. That's where your insurance goes. That's why you have high credit card bills. You cannot recompense someone for losing their clinical data. You can't repair that damage that's been done. So in a sense, we compare ourselves to the financial sector all the time. It doesn't apply in this domain because we can't make up for losing data in the way that you can get your money back from the banks. Very strong, standardised, almost across Europe, data transfer agreements between clinical institutions, between providers, so that everybody, in the same way that we have the Data Protection Act, well, the Data Protection Act in the UK, but it's standardised across Europe. We almost need the same level of agreement for data sharing and responsibilities and etc. So people can be certified and we can know very easily that things are going to be handled in an appropriate way. Of course it's doable, anything is, I mean, if you'd asked about, the data protection directives and legislation across Europe, you would have thought that was an impossible task. They've done it. It just takes will. And more importantly, in this particular context, it takes industrial buy-in. So people like Amazon, Rackspace, the big computer hosting facilities have to see a market. They have to be convinced that someone's going to buy services from them in order to invest in these types of certification processes or whatever it would be to handle clinical data. Is that market there today? Probably not, because many of the applications are still in the translational phase of research. Translation is not glamorous. It's quite expensive usually, and it takes a long time. But I think that has to change, and people are starting to realise that translation is becoming more focused from all funding councils. That's only really started happening in the last few years, so we'll see in another 2, once the 5-year kind of funding cycle of project runs finishes, whether they're really starting to deliver more into translation, to the bedside, as it were. So it's a bit early to tell whether that initiative and that drive from the funding bodies is really taking effect. I hope it is, but for sure at this point in time, all I can say is that it's not happening effectively, and that's where people should be made to continue their research and push on through to delivery of things that have been validated for clinical use, rather than leaving really tantalisingly interesting concepts hanging in the air that are just out of reach for clinical service providers like me.